Hi, boys and girls. It's time for another story. Our story this afternoon is called Marooned on Wreck Rock. Do you know what marooned means? That means getting stranded somewhere. Well, we better tell you the story to see who was stranded where. Tom, he was outside, and the wind was howling all the way down that beach, and the waves were crashing. The sky was dark. It was a stormy day. It was July 13, 1828. Well, as Tom was standing there and listening to that wind and listening to the crash of those waves, his sister Anne came out. Well, Tom was 12, but Anne was 17. And he said, "What are you doing out here in this storm? It's a nasty day." And she said, "Tom, I love to go down and watch the huge waves crash on the beach on stormy days." And she took off down the beach. Well, Tom, he thought, okay, whatever she likes, it's fine. As he was standing there, just a few minutes later, here came Anne running toward him. And Tom said, "Anne, what's wrong?" And she said, "Where's Father?" And Tom said, "He's in-house with Mom." And Anne ran in the front door. Tom stood there contemplating and wondering what was going on that made Anne rush back from the beach, and what did she need Father for? Well, they lived on a tiny little island, and it was called the Island of the Dead. Not a very nice name. As he was standing there thinking, out of the front of the house flew Dad, and he was busy putting on his coat. And here came Anne right after him. And as Dad passed Tom, he said, "Come with us, Tom." And that's all he said. And Tom had never seen his 56-year-old dad running as fast as he was running down the beach. And Tom could hardly keep up. Then his dad came to a halting stop, and he turned around, and he started to whistle. And down came Hairy Man. Well, that's quite a name. And it wasn't a man at all. It was their big dog. He was a black Newfoundland. He was big. And when Dad whistled, here he came. Well, Dad and Anne got down to the wharf, and they jumped inside of their 12-foot fishing boat. And Tom, he jumped in too. And Dad said, "Get it untied, kids." They got up and they untied those ropes, and they jumped in their places. And Hairy Man, he jumped in the front of the boat, in the bow. And immediately, Dad and Anne started rowing. It's not an easy job to row against stormy waves. And they rowed straight into those waves. And Tom was thinking, what's going on? And he said, "Dad, why are we going out in this storm? You never ever take the boat out in this kind of weather." And his dad said he didn't really need to say anything, because Anne said, "Tom, when I got to the beach, I saw a big barrel floating in on the waves, and there was a mattress floating in on the waves." And then Tom didn't need to ask any more questions. He knew what that meant. There was only one thing that could mean, and that was there was a shipwreck out in the ocean somewhere. Dad turned and he said, "Tom, we're on a rescue mission." And Tom understood. As they were rowing their way out, Dad said, "Let's go down along the beach and see if there's any survivors that might have swum up." So Anne, she kept watching that beach. And sure enough, she said, "Dad, look, there's something over there on the sand." So they guided their fishing boat in. They guided it right up on the sand. Dad jumped out and they pulled the boat out of that water. And they rushed over. There were 6 men laying on the sand. And it was obvious that all 6 of them were alive. And Dad said, "Thank God that you're alive." And Dad started asking questions. One of the men was moaning. And when Dad said, "Were you in a shipwreck?" the guy went, "Oh." And Dad said, "How many others are there? Are there others that have survived?" And that man that had moaned, he said, "We don't know. We don't know. While we were swimming to the shore, we saw a little tiny island to the right of us. Maybe people stopped there. We don't know." Well, Dad pointed toward their house. And he jumped in that boat, and Tom and Anne, and of course Harry Man, got back in the boat, and they started rowing toward Wreck Rock. Well, Wreck Rock was very familiar to Dad. It was a tiny little island, but it was just like an outcropping of rocks that stood up out of the ocean. It was about 3 miles out from the beach, and it was about the size of a house, so not big at all. Well, in the distance, they could see Wreck Rock, and as they got closer, it became harder and harder to get to where those people were. They could see who knows how many. Maybe there was 200, they didn't know. But there was men and women and children standing and sitting and lying all over that little rock outcropping. Well, when they got within about 100 yards, 100 feet of that, they knew that when they were rowing, the waves were pushing them back as fast as they were going in. And Dad turned to Anne and Tom and he said, "Keep rowing to keep the boat here if you can." And then Dad looked around in the boat and he said to Tom, "Throw me that little log that's back there, that little chunk of wood." And it was about 2 feet long. Wasn't real big around. And Tom wondered, what's Dad want with this piece of wood? But he didn't ask. And Dad, he stood up in the boat. "Keep the boat steady now, boys." And he took that little piece of wood, that log, and he threw it as hard as he could throw it toward that little island. And Dad watched intently. And sure enough, one of the men rushed out and picked up that log. And then Dad could see that he had grabbed a rope, probably something that he either floated or had come off of a board that was part of that shipwreck. And he tied that rope around that little 2-foot log. And then he got a hold of the end of it. He told several of the men there on those rocks, "Hold the end of the rope." And they did. And then he got a hold of that log and he started swimming with one hand toward that little boat. But it was so hard because every time he would swim out, the waves would try to pull him back. And then Dad turned around to Hairy Man and he said, "Go fetch! Go get the stick!" And Hairy Man, to Tom's surprise, jumped right out of the bow of the boat into that icy cold, stormy waves. And he started dog paddling with all 4 of his legs, with his nose up in the air. And as they all watched, yes, he got over to that man, and with his great big mouth, he grabbed onto that log, and he started swimming back, pulling the man that was now just holding the rope with him over the top of the water. And he brought him right back to the boat. And he looked at Dad like, "I fetched it." Dad reached down and he told Hairy Man to get back in the boat. And he and Ann helped pull that guy out of the water. And the man said, "We did it! We did it!" And then he was so exhausted that he just lay down at the bottom of the boat. Well, Dad, he picked up that stick again, and he threw it as hard as he could throw it. And Tom, he looked at Hairy Man and he said, "Go fetch! Go fetch the stick!" And Hairy Man once again jumped out of the boat into those stormy waves and swam as hard as he could go out to where that stick or that little log was. But by this time, one of the ladies had waded out into the water, and she had gotten a hold of that rope. And when Hairy Man got there, Hairy Man grabbed that stick to him in his mouth, and he swam as hard as he could swim back to that little fishing boat. This went on all that day. And of course, every time the boat got full, Dad would throw the stick back, but he would motion to them that he had to unload his boat, and they would row that full load of people back to the shore and point them to their house. This went on for one day, all the next day, and all of the 3rd day, until they had rescued 163 people off that rock. And if you add the 6 that were out there on the beach that had swum to shore, you would have 169 people they saved. When they got all those people back, of course, Mother and the few other families that lived there on the island, there weren't many, they started cooking food for those starving people. Tom's house, they had 8 children. But Mom immediately got busy cooking food out of what they had for all those people, and so did the other ladies. Well, Dad, he didn't sit around. They weren't done with their rescue. They knew that there was not enough room in their few houses for all those people, 169 of them. So he got some of the men after they had eaten together, and they started building some lean-tos. Now, lean-tos are buildings that have 3 sides, and they have a slanted roof on them. It made shelter from the storm. They continued feeding all those people. And Tom, he wondered, he thought, how long will our food last? But then he remembered. And he said, my God can take care of this. Well, 8 days later, after feeding almost 170 people for 8 days, there must have been a message that had been sent out, because here to their little tiny harbor came a boat. The HMS Lines. And they had been sent out to take those people to Nova Scotia. Well, when those people had been at their house, they had been told that they were coming as immigrants. They were going to Canada, and they had come from Ireland. So that boat, the captain of it, started gathering all those people up. Yes, eventually they would get to Canada, but right now they were going to Nova Scotia. And the captain, he was a wise man. He looked around at the little handful of people that lived on that island, and he thought, they have fed them for 8 days now, and this one family has 8 children. So he double-checked around, and he found out approximately how much food they must have fed those people. And he went out to his ship, and he came back with enough bread to replace what all those people had eaten for 8 days, and enough flour to replace each of those household supplies, so they would have food till they could go to get more. And Tom thought, God took care of us. Well, that wasn't all. Several days later, in their mail, which they didn't get mail real often, there was a letter came to the Harvey household, where Tom and Ann, father and mother, lived, and all their little brothers and sisters. And the letter was from London, and it was from Lord London. And everybody knew that that was a company that had big ships that sailed. Well, sure enough, when they read the letter, Lord London owned that ship that had capsized and had been wrecked right there by their shore, and all those people had been saved from. And they sent money, 100 pounds. Now, nowadays, a pound in England is equal to about $1.39 of our money. So that 100 pounds would have been equal to $139. Now you would say, Mom spends more than that buying groceries. But in those days, that was a fortune. And the letter said, this is for you being heroes. And that money was split up amongst the people that lived on that island. And Tom thought, God can always be trusted. And boys and girls, when there is a need, God will help you to help with that need. And He will reward you in His own way. Thank you, boys and girls, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye now.